A hanging. It was in Burma, a sodden morning of the rains. A sickly light, like yellow tinfoil, was slanting over the high walls into the jail yard. We were waiting outside the condemned cells, a row of sheds fronted with double bars like small animal cages. Each cell measured about 10 feet by 10 and was quite bare, within except for a plank bed and a pot of drinking water. In some of them, brown, silent men were squatting at the inner bars, with their blankets draped around them. These were the condemned men, to be hanged within the next week or two. One prisoner had been brought out of his cell. He was a Hindu, puny wisp of a man, with a shaven head and vague, liquid eyes. He had a thick, sprouting mustache, absurdly too big for his body, rather like the mustache of a comic man on the films. 6 tall Indian warders were guarding him and getting him ready for the gallows. 2 of them stood by with rifles and fixed bayonets, while the others handcuffed him, passed a chain through his handcuffs, and fixed it to their belts and lashed his arms tight to his sides. They crowded very close about him with their hands always on him in a careful, caressing grip, as though all the while feeling him to make sure he was there. It was like men handling a fish which is still alive and may jump back into the water. But he stood quite unresisting, yielding his arms limply to the ropes, as though he could hardly notice what was happening. 8 o'clock struck, and a bugle call, desolately thin in the wet air, floated from the distant barracks. The superintendent of the jail, who was standing apart from the rest of us, moodily prodding the gravel with his stick, raised his head at the sound. He was an army doctor, with a gray toothbrush mustache and a gruff voice. "For God's sake, hurry up, Francis," he said irritably. "Man ought to be dead by this time. Aren't you ready yet?" Francis, the head jailer, a fat Dravidian in a white drill suit and gold spectacles, waved his black hand. Yes, sir. Yes, sir," he bubbled. "All is satisfactorily prepared. The hangman is with me. We shall proceed." "Well, quick march then. The prisoners can't get their breakfast till this job's over," said the superintendent. We set out for the gallows. 2 warders marching on either side of the prisoner with their rifles at the slope. 2 others marched close against him, gripping him by arm and shoulder, as though at once pushing and supporting him. The rest of us, magistrates and the like, followed behind. Suddenly, when we had gone about 10 yards, the procession stopped short, without any order or warning. A dreadful thing had happened. A dog, come goodness knows whence, had appeared in the yard. It came bounding among us with a loud volley of barks and leapt round us, wagging its whole body, wild with glee at finding so many human beings together. It was a large woolly dog, half Airedale, half pariah. For a moment it pranced round us, and then, before anyone could stop it, it made a dash for the prisoner, and jumped up and tried to lick his face. Everyone stood aghast, too taken aback even to grab at the dog. "Who let that bloody brute in here?" said the superintendent angrily. "Catch it, someone." A warder, detached from the escort, charged clumsily after the dog, but it danced and gamboled just out of his reach, taking everything as part of the game. A young Eurasian jailer picked up a handful of gravel and tried to stone the dog away, but it dodged the stones and came after us again. Its yaps echoed from the jail walls. The prisoner, in the grasp of the 2 warders, looked on incuriously, as though this was another formality of the hanging. It was several minutes before someone managed to catch the dog. Then we put my kerchief to its collar and moved off once more, with the dog still straining and whimpering. It was about 40 yards to the gallows. I watched the brown back of the prisoner marching in front of me. He walked clumsily with his bound arms, but quite steadily, with that bobbing gait of the Indian who never straightens his knees. At each step, his muscles slid neatly into place. The lock of hair on his scalp danced up and down. His feet printed themselves on the wet ground. And once, in spite of the men who gripped him by each shoulder, he stepped slightly aside to avoid a puddle on the path. It is curious. Until that moment, I had never realized what it means to destroy a healthy, conscious man. When I saw the prisoner step aside to avoid the puddle, I saw the mystery, the unspeakable wrongness of cutting a life short when it is in full tide. This man was not dying. He was alive just as we were alive. All the organs of his body were working. Bowels digesting food, skin renewing itself, nails growing, tissues forming, all toiling away in solemn tomfoolery. His nails would still be growing when he stood on the drop, when he was falling through the air with a tenth of a second to live. His eyes saw the yellow grapple and the gray walls, and his brain still remembered, foresaw, reasoned even about puddles. He and we were a party of men walking together, seeing, hearing, feeling, understanding the same world. And in 2 minutes, with a sudden snap, one of us would be gone. One mind less, one world less. The gallows stood in a small yard separate from the main grounds of the prison and overgrown with tall prickly weeds. It was a brick erection like 3 sides of a shed with planking on top, and above that 2 beams and a crossbar with the rope dangling. The hangman, a gray-haired convict in the white uniform of the prison, was waiting beside his machine. He greeted us with a servile crouch as we entered. At a word from Francis, the 2 warders, gripping the prisoner more closely than ever, half led, half pushed him to the gallows and helped him clumsily up the ladder. Then the hangman climbed up and fixed the rope around the prisoner's neck. We stood waiting 5 yards away. The warders had formed in a rough circle around the gallows. And then, when the noose was fixed, the prisoner began crying out to his God. It was a high, reiterated cry of Ram, 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 Ram. Not urgent and fearful, like a prayer or a cry for help, but steady, rhythmical, almost like the tolling of a bell. The dog answered the sound with a whine. The hangman, still standing on the gallows, produced a small cotton bag, like a flour bag, and drew it down over the prisoner's face. But the sound, muffled by the cloth, still persisted over and over again. Ram, 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 ram. The hangman climbed down and stood ready, holding the lever. Minutes seemed to pass. The steady, muffled cry from the prisoner went on and on. Ram, 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 never faltering for an instant. The superintendent, his head on his chest, was slowly poking the ground with his stick. Perhaps he was counting the cries, allowing the prisoner a fixed number. 50, perhaps, or 100. Everyone had changed color. The Indians had gone gray like bad coffee, and 1 or 2 of the bayonets were wavering. We looked at the lashed, hooded man on the drop and listened to his cries. each cry another second of life. The same thought was in all our minds. Oh, kill him quickly. Get it over. Stop that abominable noise. Suddenly, the superintendent made up his mind. Throwing his head, he made a swift motion with his stick. "Challo," he shouted, almost fiercely. There was a clanking noise, and then dead silence. The prisoner had vanished, and the rope was twisting on itself. I let go of the dog, and it galloped immediately to the back of the gallows. But when it got there, it stopped short, barked, and then retreated into a corner of the yard, where it stood among the weeds, looking timorously out at us. We went round the gallows to inspect the prisoner's body. He was dangling with his toes pointed straight downwards, very slowly revolving, as dead as a stone. The superintendent reached out with his stick and poked the bare body. It oscillated slightly. "He's all right," said the superintendent. He backed out from under the gallows and blew out a deep breath. The moody look had gone out of his face quite suddenly. He glanced at his wristwatch. 8 minutes past 8. Well, that's all for the morning, thank God. The warders unfixed bayonets and marched away. The dog, sobered and conscious of having misbehaved itself, slipped after them. We walked out of the gallows yard, past the condemned cells with their waiting prisoners, into the big central yard of the prison. The convicts, under the command of warders armed with lathis, were already receiving their breakfast. They squatted in long rows, each man holding a tiny pannikin, while 2 warders with buckets marched round ladling out rice. It seemed quite a homely, jolly scene after the hanging. An enormous relief had come over us now that the job was done. One felt an impulse to sing, to break into a run, to snigger. All at once, everyone began chatting gaily. The Eurasian boy walking beside me nodded towards the way we had come with an enormous smile. "Do you know, sir, our friend," he meant the dead man, "when he heard his appeal had been dismissed, he pissed on the floor of his cell. From fright. Kindly take one of my cigarettes, sir. Do you not admire my new silver case, sir? From the Boxwalla, 2 rupees, 8 annas. Classy European style." Several people laughed at what nobody seemed certain. Francis was walking by the superintendent, talking garrulously. "Well, sir, all has passed off with the utmost satisfactoriness. It was all finished. Quick, like that. It is not always so, oh no. I have known cases where the doctor was obliged to go beneath the gallows and pull the prisoner's legs to ensure distance. Most disagreeable." "Wriggling about, eh? That's bad," said the superintendent. "Ah, sir, it is worse when they become refractory. One man, I recall, clung to the bars of his cage when we went to take him out. You will scarcely credit, sir, that it took 6 warders to dislodge him, 3 pulling at each leg. We reasoned with him. 'My dear sir,' we said, 'think of all the pain and trouble you are causing us.' But no, he would not listen. Ah, he was very troublesome. I found that I was laughing quite loudly. Everyone was laughing. Even the superintendent grinned in a tolerant way. 'You'd better all come out and have a drink,' he said, quite genially. 'I've got a bottle of whiskey in the car. We could do with it.' We went through the big double gates of the prison into the road. 'Pulling at his legs,' exclaimed a Burmese magistrate suddenly, and burst into a loud chuckling. We all began laughing again. At that moment, Francis's anecdote seemed extraordinarily funny. We all had a drink together, native and European alike, quite amicably. The dead man was 100 yards away. So that's George Orwell. All right, so why did I want to read that today? Well, let me ask you some questions. The first time I read this essay, I was confused about the dog and why this was an awful thing. A dreadful thing had happened. A dog, come goodness knows whence, had appeared in the yard. It came bounding among us with a loud volley of barks, and leapt round us, wagging its whole body, wild with glee at finding so many human beings together. So what's so dreadful about this dog?
It's like a deep contrast of what's actually happening, and it's unaware of what's happening.
Yeah, it's unaware of what's happening, right? Right? Why is it dreadful for these jailers to come into contact with this dog who is aware of what's happening? Or unaware of what's happening, I should say. Why is this dreadful for them?
The dog doesn't know that one of them is condemned.
Mm-hmm.
It's treating them all the same because it is his face, and then they have to acknowledge that it's the person.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. Right? The dog, I think Orwell chooses his language very carefully, right? Wild with glee at finding so many human beings together. So in some ways, the dog is recognizing that these are all humans. And the precondition of the hanging is that the warders in some way treat the prisoner as if he was not a human. Some other language for you. This is the very beginning of the essay. We were waiting outside the condemned cells, a row of sheds fronted with double bars, like small animal cages. Yeah.
I feel like when they also make the metaphor that he's like a salmon or a fish that are trying to hold back.
Mm-hmm.
Like the dog just like, because that's truly an animal, it kind of like equalizes everyone to the, it equalizes the prisoner to the handlers, like they're all just humans, and that this dog is kind of what truly an animal is, and that they're all just humans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's this language which indicates that the humans are treating the prisoner like an animal, like a fish, right? Or being put into a small cage. Right? Go ahead and close your laptops if they're still open. But then, ironically, it is an animal, the dog, which causes all of the humans to realize, oh, we're all human. Yeah.
I can also think of it like as a non-biased view, because like at first, if we say when jailers are considered, as you said, like trapped in a cage like a dog, like an animal.
Mm-hmm.
But then when like an actual animal is considered one as for human beings, so it's kind of like a non-biased, and like he doesn't know what's happening. So.
Yeah. I mean, the dog is outside of this human culture.
Yeah.
Right? That has, through the materiality of the cages and the sort of the power structure of the prison, created, from the perspective of the jailers, different kinds of humans, to the extent that there's some that aren't human at all. They're really treated like animals. Yeah, and then the dog, who's not part of human culture and therefore is in some ways unbiased, doesn't recognize that. Until when? Does the dog stay in its ignorance the whole story?
Mhm.
What happens?
I think when they kind of lose track of where the prisoner was, they kind of put their trust in the dog to find the prisoner. But then I think he realizes like what the situation is, and so he doesn't lead them there.
Okay, I'm a little not following. What do you mean by they lose track of the prisoner?
Like they stop regarding him as an animal life,
Oh,
and then they start like the dog was put there to kind of force the fact into the jailer's head that they are also human while they were like maybe taught to believe and treat them like animals.
right. Yeah, so there's this moment when they all collectively realize this is a human being that we're going to kill. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And of course, perhaps that's where this collective thought comes, where they say, get it over with. We just want to get it over with. And then after it's over, the dog goes up to the prisoner expecting to find a live prisoner, right? And the dog recognizes death and is shocked by that. So even at the end, the dog comes to recognize that something awful has happened. Okay, so the warders, the jailers, the wardens come to recognize that this prisoner is human. How does Orwell view what it means to be a human being? What are some of the insights that he has?
Like when he steps around the puddle. I think that's a very, like, he's still, it's like, it's just giving perspective into what he's still thinking about during the time. Like, he still sees himself just as a human, like, just stepping around the puddle, like, I don't want to step in the puddle. Like, it's just a very humane thing to do. Like, no dog is gonna step around the puddle, or maybe.
He like goes through and describes what it is, like the thought, like being able to think and reason and things like that, like as a human.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Also, when he was describing when he actually, I think it was when he actually did like die, but he said a life is gone and a world is gone. So human is just another contribution to the world and the environment and how people interact with each other.
Yeah, a life is gone, the world is gone. It's very evocative. Anthropology tends to, so far as it tries to be a science, treat human beings a little bit like objects, come up with these attributes or qualities that each human being has, sort of like they're hydrogen atoms or different species of dog or something, you know, like, but that they're part of the world, that this world is made up of all these different kinds of humans interacting in these particular ways. But for Orwell, each human being is a world. Yeah, that's important enough. Let's read that. I'll read that again. It is curious, but till that moment I had never realized what it means to destroy a healthy, conscious man. When I saw the prisoner step aside to avoid the puddle, I saw the mystery, the unspeakable wrongness of cutting a life short when it is in full tide. This man was not dying. He was alive just as we were. All the organs of his body were working, bowels digesting food, skin renewing itself, nails growing, tissue forming, all toiling away in solemn tomfoolery. His nails would still be growing when he stood on the drop, when he was falling through the air, the tenth of a second to live. His eyes saw the yellow gravel and the gray walls, and his brain still remembered, foresaw, reasoned even about puddles. He and we were a party of men walking together, seeing, hearing, feeling, understanding the same world. And in 2 minutes, with a sudden snap, one of us would be gone. One mind less, one world less. So we have this reference to these different aspects of what it means to be human. Right? We have the physical part of what it means to be human, and the materiality of what it means to be human, biology of what it means to be human. This is connected to movement, right, around the puddle, which itself is connected to reasoning even about puddles. And then there's this transition to human beings as communal in some way. We were a party of men, walking together, seeing, hearing, feeling, understanding the same world. So it's not just that we're these atomized people, all separate, all hearing differently, feeling differently, thinking differently. There's a way in which our feelings and thinkings and walkings are in some ways connected to other human beings. Even as we may, and even as they do, objectify human beings and separate some humans from the category of the human, put them in the category of the animal. One mind less, one world less. Each human being a world. This passage reminds me of John Donne's poem. Misquoted here, but there's for two reasons. This phrase, one mind less, one world less, but also because he references the bell when the prisoner is saying ram, ram, ram on the gallows. So John Donne says, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. And the more famous, send not to ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. So the bell would be tolling for somebody dying. And John Donne said, when someone dies, I am less because I partake in humanity. Just like when one part of Europe washes away from the sea, Europe is less. One human being is gone, I am less because I am part of humanity. And then he says, so ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. I think Orwell is evoking that. It might be worth reading that poem here. Someone can, actually, I don't want to do it because I don't want to waste time, but if somebody looks up John Donne, you all should know this poem, it's a classic. And let's see, what's it called? This is the famous line, ask not for whom the bell tolls. That phrase right there is the phrase which Hemingway uses as the title for his book, which won the Nobel Prize, When the Bell Tolls. Also in the book. Okay, so anyway, if somebody gets that poem, let me know. All right, so we've got this idea of human beings as visceral, right, as embodied, also as communal. That there is something about human beings that pertains to reason, right? And that this, in some ways, the consideration of these things is a horrifying thought. If one is to snuff out that life. Right? So what happens at the end, after the prisoner is killed? And I'll go back to the barracks. What happens?
They just go back to the barracks and start their day like they normally would.
Yeah,
Like drinking whiskey and telling stories about other prisoners that they've
right,
to the gallows.
exactly. They're all laughing,
Mhm.
right? So the illusion is continued, right? We had this moment when the dog came in and the prisoners, or the warders realized that this was an actual human being they were about to kill. They realized the wrongness of it, the gravity of it. And now they're going to go back to the prison. They're going to take up this classification and perspective and relation to the prisoners as if the prisoners were functionally animals. Right? They tell stories and laugh about a prisoner who they had to physically drag out of the cell in order to hang him, and this becomes something that they perceive as funny. And they take up this way of being. Do you think it'd be possible for them to run the prison without considering, in the way that they do, without considering the prisoners as animals? Objects? No. Why not?
Too much humility would like probably guilt them.
Just empathy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think seeing, even if you're not, you know, a super empathetic person, there is a certain level of like contributing to other people's suffering, especially just like probably be hard to cope with if you were actually seeing them.
The warders found the experience of waiting for the man to be hung as intolerable, as extraordinarily unpleasant. I think it's an open question whether or not that kind of feeling could be something that a person could live with every day, all day.
I feel like people in the prison are not like the best people, and they treated others not as equals. That's why they are in the prison. So I don't think there should be like they should feel that they did something bad. That's why they are treated not that good in prison.
Do you think Orwell would disagree with you?
Sorry.
Do you think Orwell would disagree with you?
I mean, according to this, yeah, he thinks that he's the author, right?
Yeah.
I think according to this that you read for us, according to this, it would disagree with me because I was thinking that
Mm-hmm.
everyone should be treated equally, right? If I got
What do you all think? Do you think that Orwell is
the
making?
main idea right?
Well, let's make that a question. Do you think that that's Orwell's argument that the prisoners should be treated equally with non-prisoners? So you think it's the case? I'm just sort of asking everybody else. Do you think that's Orwell's overall argument or perspective? Or do you think he's even making an argument?
I mean, he's not explicitly making an argument, but he's definitely making his feelings known.
Do you think he's writing about incarceration per se, or about execution? Or both?
He's using it to make his commentary, but I don't know what it is.
So my reading on it, and you can push back of course, is that Orwell is really talking about an execution here. I don't think he's making the case that prisoners should be treated exactly like non-prisoners, where they wouldn't be in prison to begin with. I think he's making a claim about the kinds of relationships that human beings have to create for themselves among each other in order to tolerate actually killing somebody. I think the kind of the hinge of the essay is the paragraph that I just read. I had never realized what it means to destroy a healthy, conscious man. So I think the commentary is really about what it means, right? terms of the relationships that have to be set up in order for human beings to feel other human beings.
There's something that I noticed is it's not the wardens who actually, operate the machinery, they make another prisoner do it. Then it's one of
The
prisoners.
hangman throws the switch, but I think it is, let me take a look at it here. The gallows, I don't believe the prisoner does it. Yeah, so Orwell doesn't actually describe the hangman. Usually there's a trap door, right, and then it switches. So the superintendent makes a swift motion with his stick, and I think that's intended to signal to the hangman to throw a lever. And then afterwards it says there was a clanking noise and then dead silence. But I think you are getting at something there, which is that Orwell doesn't attribute the execution to one particular person, right?
I think the only way that they can make sure that this execution runs through is that the hangman?
Mhm.
He's the only one who doesn't have direct contact with the prisoner. And if he did, I feel like that would make it a lot harder to actually pull the switch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that Orwell refers to the hanging apparatus as a machine, right? I think that's a really interesting word. So it's almost as if the prisoner is being fed into this impersonal machine that would kill him rather than an actual human being taking ownership or agency for killing him.
I think he's just been programmed to do what he's told and like when to do it. Like the guards tell him when to do it.
Yeah, well, I think that is interesting, to think about culpability for this. Orwell doesn't, to my view, assign it to anybody. It's sort of a collective act, right? They all kind of accomplish together. And so perhaps each particular person could disavow their own participation in it by seeing themselves as being part of the system.
I feel like why he chose like the prison as like the setting was like a very important thing. Like it makes it seem like it's just one small little world in its own, like its own small society, and that like that's how they can distort like these humans to becoming animals like in their brains because it's their own society's own like kind of view of how they can like within that society they can distort between what a human and a like animal is, and then like the dog comes in and kind of like breaks this reality of like what is real.
Yeah, breaks the spell. I would also say that breaks the spell that's been created. So that I think, yeah, I like your interpretation here. I think it's productive. We're thinking about this. Okay, worlds, right? There's a world of the jail, and it's demarcated by these walls, right? And within this particular world, you can cast this spell where certain humans are put into a different category, maybe a category of a non-human animal. And then this dog is this chaotic, interrupting force, which momentarily breaks the spell that the warders and the jailers have cast over themselves for the purposes of making the execution more tolerable. It's really interesting. So we have like 2 minutes left. I just wanted to sort of say my motivation for bringing this in. And whenever I assign an essay, I don't know exactly where we're going to go in the conversation, so I don't have a particular set of things I want to emphasize. But anthropology as a social science, it tends to treat people like atoms a little bit, like objects, as sort of objects with certain attributes, whether that's racial, ethnic, linguistic, cultural attributes. And then there is this idea that if you properly investigate sort of a representative object attribute of a general class of object attributes, as you have in this paper of yours, that you can generalize to claims about all the other so-called or supposed object attributes. treat human beings scientifically the way that we would a hydrogen atom. You know, or the way a geologist would investigate a rock, you know. It's almost as if you guys went out and took a look at a strata of rock and picked out like a little rock that you were going to interview and said, okay, I'm going to interview this little rock, and then I'm going to find out about this huge strata. And necessarily when you're doing that, you're kind of bringing human beings into the realm of objecthood, and you're treating them a little bit like objects. And that can be, that has its downsides. It has its downsides. And I think you know, the humanities, and especially essays like Orwell's, push back against that a little bit and make the claim that there's something sacred about human beings, and that human beings are not objects that form up some larger world. Each human being is their own world, and consequently there's something that's in some religious language that's blasphemous about snuffing out one of those worlds. And so as you go out, I just want you to think a little critically about the ethical, moral, relational implications of the social sciences and kind of the ways we've talked about human beings in this class, which pulls human beings into the realm of objecthood, kind of treats human beings in some ways like objects, and how important it is to, in some ways, push back against that and to recognize that fundamentally human beings aren't objects. What implications that has for you and for your life. So that's it. Thanks for showing up every week, and I'll see you on Tuesday.